Thank you so much. It's good to be with all of you. And it's good to see some familiar faces from when I was in your community a year and a half ago. And it's also especially nice to see my parents. I think my sisters might be here as well. So hi. And we're going to have a lot of fun together this month. We're going to start tonight, and there's a lot to talk about. Because stories, of course, I think it's safe to say that not only are stories in our DNA as Jews, and perhaps as human beings, but stories are our DNA. And so we have to consider some things. But the first thing I want to share is that when I walk around in my home, or in the olden days, when I walked around in a library or a school, and you see those enormous bookshelves, I see some of them behind some of you, with Jewish books and books of stories and books of teachings and legends, I can hear the books whispering from the shelves. And I can hear the stories, and the images stay with me. And I'm sure they stay with you as well. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. There was once a king who had 6 sons and a daughter, and the daughter became lost, and the king sent a messenger to look for her. Someone must have been talking about Joseph K. There are stories that stay with us from Jewish tradition, from antiquity and from modernity, and from all points in between. And we have to ask, what is the power of Jewish stories? What role do they play in Jewish tradition and culture? How are Jewish stories essential to understanding the survival and creative thriving of our people in all of our vast wanderings throughout geography and time and all kinds of circumstances? And so there's a lot to understand about this, but of course, if we're going to talk about stories, and if we're going to talk about the Jewish love affair with stories, we have to talk about the human relationship with stories. What is it about stories that makes them so powerful and so essential to our lives? And of course, there's a lot to say about this, and that's not our core topic. So very briefly, I want to just share with you a little exercise. And I want you to look at the image on the screen, and I'll describe it for any of you who have trouble seeing it. This is from a wonderful book by Chris Van Allsburg, one of my favorite children's book illustrators and authors, who wrote and illustrated Jumanji, which became a famous movie and a remake of a movie, and many other books that are very well known. But this is my favorite of his books. It's from a book called The Mysteries of Harris Burdick. The Mysteries of Harris Burdick. And the conceit of the book is that a children's book author illustrator walked into an editorial office with a portfolio of single images, each one from a different story. He left the portfolio on the desk of an editor and was never seen again. And so all we have from this fictional, imaginary children's book author illustrator is individual images, some of them with text, some of them without. And the book is constructed in such a way that we are meant to look at the image and make up the story that the image was imaginarily, fictionally taken from. And so this is the first one. It's an image of a nun sitting in a chair, and the chair is somehow levitating in space while 2 priests look on, and they're in a giant cathedral. And there's a line of text that says, "The 5th one ended up in France." So just take a moment and imagine what this story is. What's happening before and after? What is the story about? We're not going to quiz you on this. We don't have time to go around and hear from everyone, but if you'd like to put something in the chat, you certainly can. Just take a moment and imagine the story around this image. And I'm going to move to another one in a moment. Here's another image from The Mysteries of Harris Burdick. This is an image of a house. It looks like in a suburban neighborhood, maybe in the 50s, or maybe in the future. There's a car that sort of looks like it's from the 50s. There's a mailbox on the street. There's a light on in the attic. And of course, the most striking thing about the image is that this house is launching into the air like a rocket ship. So what is happening in this story? What happens before and after? What is this story about? What is this book about? And one more. A sleeping girl with a book open next to her on the bed, and vines are growing out of the book. Vines are growing out of the center of the book. And so we have to understand that unlike ideology, stories are open. They're open to interpretation. They're evocative. They invite our imagination. And unlike law, stories are fuzzy and difficult to grasp. And we'll talk more about the relationship between law and story in Judaism. But we have to know that the power of stories comes in large measure due to their mystery. The Jews have always loved stories. The Jews have always produced stories, listened to stories, conveyed stories. We begin our first sacred text with a story. And if you think about the gifts of the Jews to humanity, one of the most fundamental gifts that the Jewish people have given the world is a sequence of stories that have really shaped human history, human values, human conversations. From the Garden of Eden, which we will be digging into in greater depth in one of the series, in the Greatest Jewish Tales series. The Garden of Eden is a story that has provided food for the imagination of playwrights and novelists and songwriters, and people looking at the sky and longing for a better world. The sense of loss that we sometimes feel, that we have a home that we're far away from, and the imagery of a tree of knowledge and a tree of life. The imagery of the Exodus, of exile and return. You know that the story of the Exodus, which we begin to read actually this week in the Torah portion that we'll read on Shabbat, we're beginning the story of the Exodus. And that is, of course, a powerful story that has inspired, among many other people, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who drew on the Exodus story, the story of slaves who were freed by God in his work on behalf of his people and all people for civil rights and human rights. So many revolutions in human history began with stories. So in the case of the Exodus, Moses came to a tyrant, the Pharaoh, and the people who were enslaved by that Pharaoh, and told them a story of a strange but vaguely familiar God appearing in a fiery burning bush that was not consumed. This began a revolution. Thousands of years later, a storyteller in Eastern Europe, the Baal Shem Tov, traveled around to marketplaces and synagogues, drawing in listeners like moths to a flame, telling stories that ignited a revolution of the spirit. So we know that stories are powerful, and there are so many other stories. As a species, we have many creation stories, for example, in every human culture. There are stories in our tradition of what happens after the creation. The first two human beings, the first children of those first human beings, one a killer and one a victim, half of humanity murdered by the other half, the story of Cain and Abel. A father holding a knife over his beloved son, the story of the Akedah, the near sacrifice, or perhaps actual sacrifice, of Isaac by Abraham. Brother fighting brother, Jacob wrestling with the angel and getting a new name, which becomes our name, the name of our people, Israel, and the name of our homeland, Israel. Stories are human, they're powerful. But what makes a story Jewish? What makes a story particularly Jewish? I want to offer 4 ideas. There are many others, and this could be a topic for a year-long conversation at least. What makes a story Jewish? But here are 4 ideas or principles that I think we can consider about Jewish stories in particular. Number 1, and here I'm drawing on the teachings of my teacher, Professor Elie Wiesel, of blessed memory, who spoke of this very often. A Jewish tale, unlike other tales, has memory. And we might say that every Jewish story is connected to every other Jewish story. Every Jewish story evokes or points to another story. And so when you enter a story, it's like entering a room where you see many, many doorways, and you know that you can enter other rooms from that story. And in fact, one of the literary styles we find in Jewish storytelling is the story within the story. Or sometimes the story within the story within the story. And very occasionally it goes even further. And you have stories nested in other stories, stories that reference other stories, stories building on other stories, stories that are commentaries on earlier stories, stories that challenge other stories, stories that try to reveal what's really happening in earlier stories. Jewish stories have memory. That's what makes them Jewish. Second, every Jewish story has two elements. And you can test this when you read Jewish stories, and come back and tell me if you find something that defies this definition. But so far, every Jewish story I've ever seen has two elements. It has joy, and it has some element of tears, some element of a cry of the heart, an awareness of human suffering, but also laughter and also hope. And those two elements together, which in daily life are often difficult to hold together, that makes a tale Jewish. We don't have to choose between joy and the awareness of pain. And in fact, this plays out also, as you may know, in Jewish moments, in Jewish time. For example, at a Jewish wedding, have you ever seen usually the groom at the end of the wedding break the glass? So the groom breaks the glass in memory of the destruction of the temple and the beginning of our long exile at a moment of tremendous joy. Precisely at the moment of joy, we can remember the pain, and we can bring the pain into the joy and somehow heal it. And there are many, many examples of this. Every Jewish story has joy and tears. Every Jewish story combines connection between people, horizontal connections, and vertical connections to the divine. Many, many Jewish stories conceive of the divine in radically different ways from one another. There's not one clear definition of God in Judaism, and that's in fact one of the things that differentiates Judaism as a tradition. Our God has a name that we can't even pronounce. We don't even know how to pronounce it, even if we wanted to. What does that mean? It means that in Jewish thinking, the divine cannot be named. And as soon as you name it or define it, you are in the realm of idolatry. And so Jewish stories point to the mystery of the divine and the mystery of other people and relationships between people. Every Jewish story, finally, has an ethical element. It teaches us something, often indirectly, sometimes in surprising ways, about how to live better, how to live with greater kindness and compassion. I'll give you one striking example. You know that many traditions have not only creation stories, but a myth or a story about a great flood that destroyed the world, and there's a survivor or a small group of survivors. Traditions and cultures across the globe have such stories, including on this continent, which points to some possibility that there actually was some kind of deluge in antiquity or before antiquity. But if you compare the stories of the flood in the ancient Near East and the Sumerian version, the Akkadian version, you can read Gilgamesh, the Epic of Gilgamesh, where Gilgamesh meets the Noah figure, whose name is Utnapishtim, tells him the story of the flood. If you compare all of those stories of the flood in ancient Near Eastern cultures to the Jewish version, there's one very, very important difference. And the difference is that the reason for the flood in all of those cultures is something like, in one version it's this exactly, human beings were making too much noise and it was waking up the gods. And they got annoyed, and so they flooded the earth. That's why the flood happened. If you ever wondered why the flood happened, we were making too much noise. We bothered the gods. In the Jewish version, think back for a moment, what's the reason that the Torah, that the Bible gives us for the flood? It has nothing to do with God. It's that people are mistreating one another. People are stealing from one another. People aren't observing the proper boundaries with one another. Jewish stories have an ethical dimension, and they teach us. So this begins with the Bible, and of course, one of the famous questions about the Bible, the Jewish Bible, and the book of Genesis in particular, is why does the Torah begin with a story? The very first question of the great commentator Rashi, the medieval commentator who's known as the father of all the commentators, Rashi, who lived in France and owned a vineyard and had 3 brilliant daughters who studied with him. Rashi asks, the very first question he asks, quoting a sage of the Talmud 1,000 years earlier, why does the Torah begin with a story? If the Torah is a book of law, then why doesn't the Torah begin, why doesn't the Bible begin with the first law? The first communal law has to do with creating a calendar. This law appears in Exodus. God tells the Jewish people, Moses and Aaron, to tell the Jewish people to create a calendar, a lunar calendar. It's the first law. This is a book of laws. We should begin with law. Why do we need the story of creation? Why do we need the story of the flood? Why do we need the story of the Tower of Babel? Why do we need the story of the matriarchs and patriarchs and the tribes? And why? Why do we need all of this? And Rashi gives an answer. Rashi says it's because the Torah wants to teach us right away that everything belongs to God, and therefore God has the right of ownership over every parcel of land on earth. And so God took the land of Israel from the ancient Canaanite nations and gave it to the Jewish people. And so our claim to the land of Israel comes from the creation of the world and from God. So Rashi gives a very political answer to this question, but other commentators give other answers. And the question itself remains. There are some questions that are so good that even when you answer them, the questions remain. And the question of why the Torah begins with story might have another answer. It might be the case that the assumption is wrong and that the Torah, the Bible, is not a book of laws at all. Perhaps the Bible is a book of law and legend. Perhaps we need both law and story in order to live a good life. Perhaps law without story is problematic. And so the great philosopher, modern philosopher, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, there's a lot to say about Heschel, but he was obsessed with this idea of the relationship between law and legend. And he writes about it in his book, Between God and Man, very beautifully. He writes, halacha, which is usually translated as Jewish law, but literally means the going or the way of walking, the way we walk in the world. But it's the practical stuff. It's, how do you make sure that the food is kosher? And how do you make sure that you're observing the Shabbat, the Sabbath, in the correct way? And all the practical details of Jewish life, individual and communal life. Halacha deals with subjects that can be expressed literally. Agadah is the word for stories in the Talmud. And Agadah literally means the telling. Agadah, the telling, the storytelling, introduces us to a realm that lies beyond the range of expression. The law gives us the norms for action. The story gives us the vision of the ends, the purposes of living. The law prescribes. The story suggests. The law decrees. The story inspires. Halacha is definite. Agadah is elusive and is open to interpretation. And you see, actually, we'll see this together in several of the series over the coming month, that one of the core principles of the way the Jewish tradition unfolded through the rabbinic era is that the rabbis are always arguing. In fact, we're going to have a whole series about tales of conflict and controversy, because 2 Jews, 3 opinions is a real thing. And we have to explore that. We have to explore the role of controversy in Jewish tradition. The rabbis are often arguing about the law. And at the end of the day, the rabbis have to decide the law, because we have to figure out how to behave. We have to figure out how to create communal norms. How do you register for CSP? If I register differently than you, then the system's not going to work. Ari's not going to see my name on the list. Something's going to break down or get lost. I'm not going to get the gift at the end. Something's going to break. We're not going to be in the same community. How do we create a community? By creating very clear, consistent norms. That's what happens with law, with halacha, with behavior. But when the rabbis talk about stories and legend, if you think I'm going to say they don't disagree, you're wrong. They completely disagree all the time, as we'll see, but they never try to determine the bottom line. They leave the disagreements open. All opinions remain on the table, and you can believe whatever you'd like to believe about the realm of Agadah, because stories can coexist. It's very easy to argue with an ideology or a law or a policy. It's very difficult to argue with a story, and the rabbis teach us that you don't have to argue with stories. They can coexist even if they're very, very different. And so here Heschel is telling us that the law gives us the norms for behavior, but the story gives us the reasons and the inspiration and the suggestions and the imaginative allusions that can help us bring meaning to our life of practice. And he continues to maintain that the essence of Judaism consists exclusively of halacha is as erroneous as to maintain that the essence of Judaism consists exclusively of agadah. The interrelationship of law and story is the very heart of Judaism. That's a very radical claim. The interrelationship of law and story is the very heart of Judaism. If you take one away, you've lost the heart of Judaism. Halacha without agadah is dead. Law without story is dead. Agadah without halacha is wild. Story without any sort of shared norms of behavior is wild and chaotic. That's Heschel on the relationship between law and story. And in fact, Heschel's first major work, which in Hebrew is called Torah min hashamayim ba'aspaklaria shel adorot, Torah from heaven through the lens of the generations. It's a long, unwieldy title, in English at least, deals with this question. His first major book is about the relationship between law and story in the Talmud and in rabbinic literature. And so we have to remember that when Rashi asks the question, why does the Torah begin with story? We might have answered, well, Torah doesn't mean law. Torah is often translated as law, but it doesn't mean law. Torah means teaching. And if you know Hebrew, you know it means teaching. It means lehorot. A moreh is a teacher. Torah means teaching. And teaching, of course, must include law, norms, values, practical advice, but also story. What is the relationship between the two? In a sense, what Heschel is saying is that law tells us how to live and story tells us why to live. And because stories are difficult to argue with, because stories are universal, and because stories are inclusive and they can unite us, and because stories can move us, they don't only speak to our cognitive selves, stories can move our hearts. Stories are very important today, in a time of great polarization, in a time of breakdown of communication, against the backdrop of this pandemic and the isolation it brings, and the anxiety it brings, and the difficulties it brings, and the threats to health. What stories are we going to tell about these times? That's a question that's echoing in my thoughts all the time right now. What stories are we going to tell? What stories do we want to be told about us? What stories can we tell right now to bring some light and grace to the situation in which we find ourselves? What elements are we going to emphasize? Briefly, I want to share with you that there are three major periods of Jewish history to consider when we talk about the Jewish love affair with stories. The first is the biblical, which we've spoken about a bit, but I just want to add, and we'll see this throughout the month, the Bible is famous for its mysterious qualities, for the terseness of the language, for the spare quality of its storytelling, and for the sense that you get when you read the Bible that there's a lot going on between the lines. We have themes throughout, especially the book of Genesis, but all the way through Genesis and Exodus and even further, certain themes appear again and again. One of them is the attempt by God to create a world and God's repeated seeming failures. That's a theologically surprising idea that you find in the Torah. The world is not perfect when God creates it. And the flood is a key moment in that process, but it continues even later. And God needs human beings to help continue the growth and evolution of the world. And that is a mission that at first belongs to all of humanity, but all of humanity can't get it right. And so it becomes the mission of one family. And that one family becomes the Jewish people, and that mission becomes the Jewish mission. And there's a lot to talk about the relationship between the Jewish mission and the mission of all of humanity. Because we'll see over the course of our month together that the particular mission of the Jewish people is always in service of all of humanity. It's ultimately a universal mission, and everyone is a part of that mission, but the Jewish people have a particular role to play in catalyzing that mission and supporting and empowering that mission among everyone else. That mission is one of the themes of the Bible. Who is going to continue the mission? Who is going to carry it forward? Sibling rivalry is a major theme of Genesis, of course, and of Exodus. And as Professor Wiesel often pointed out, quoting his great teacher, Rabbi Saul Lieberman asked, who is the loneliest character in the Bible? Think for a moment of your own answer. Who is the loneliest character in the Bible? And Professor Wiesel, when he was a student of Saul Lieberman, suggested all kinds of characters. Moses seems to be very lonely. Sarah seems to be very lonely. Job maybe is the loneliest of all. What about Noah, who survived? All of these suggestions, and Saul Lieberman said, finally, no, the loneliest character in the Bible is God. The solitude of God is a theme of the Bible. And we have to consider what that means in Jewish theology. And those are some of the ideas in the Bible, but they're all expressed in very terse language and stories that leave us wanting more. The next period of Jewish history to consider is the Rabbinic Period. When the Rabbinic Period begins is a subject of a lot of academic debate, but we can say, for our purposes, it begins in the year 70 of the Common Era, when the Second Temple in Jerusalem is destroyed. It really begins a bit earlier than that, when the first exile happened of the 10 tribes, but let's say for our purposes, to simplify, the year 70, when the temple is destroyed, the Jewish people lose our autonomy in our homeland, we go out into exile, the rabbis begin a new project of trying to reconstitute Judaism without a temple, without a physical space, a geographic home. And part of what they do is use stories to convey religious truths. They tell stories about great sages, but they also tell stories that seem to have mystical meaning. One of the great sages of the Talmud, Rabbah bar Chana, Rabbah the son of Chana, told many stories of fantastical voyages in which he saw, for example, a frog the size of 60 towns. What does this mean? Many ink has been spilled interpreting the stories of Rabbah, the son of Chana. The rabbis told these phantasmagorical stories that seem to be like surreal fantasies, but of course, there's some meaning hiding within these stories. And the rabbis also, remember I said the Bible is very terse, and there's a lot going on between the lines. One of the key projects of the rabbis is to unpack what's happening between the lines. And so they tell stories about the Bible in the form of midrash, which literally means seeking meaning, seeking the story, seeking what's happening between the lines, to fill in the blanks. And the rabbis fill in the blanks. The rabbis were extremely careful interrogators of the text. If you're in a rush, don't ever show a rabbi a biblical verse. You'll be there for a really long time, because the rabbis would notice what's missing. They'll notice the redundancies, the repeated words. They'll notice why the Bible says it this way when it could have said it that way. There are many jokes about this, but it's really an essential element of the project of the rabbis who created Judaism as we know it, is to demand that precision of the text and to notice all the strange things in the text and to be disturbed by the text. We are not quiet readers. We are not passive readers of text. In our tradition, when you read the text, you are meant to inquire, you are meant to generate as many questions as you can, you are meant to pound on the wall of the text until it opens up to you. You are meant to interrogate the text. And the third period we'll talk about is really, I'm collapsing for the sake of time, but really the medieval through the modern period. And so, of course, many people would differentiate the two, but for our purposes, we're going to see them all together for now. And of course, the Jewish people in those times were going through many troubles, many exiles. And this is where we find tales of suffering and survival. We also find fantasies of the Messiah's arrival. We find Jews poor, oppressed, by various governments after the exile from Spain or persecutions in Eastern Europe or elsewhere, telling one another and telling their children stories about what the world will be like when the world is what it is supposed to be. What will the world look like when the Messiah comes and everyone is redeemed and there is no more suffering? We find many of these fantasies and imaginings and yearnings for a world without suffering. And part of that is stories about Jewish pride and the return of Jewish self-determination, which of course we've seen in our own days, which for Jews of 1,000 years ago would have been completely miraculous. And really it is completely miraculous. We have tales of miracles, we have tales of beggars and fools, and we find that great rabbis throughout Jewish history struggled with something that, if any of you are teachers, you may have struggled with, when your students are kind of falling asleep or your students aren't paying attention. Great rabbis dealt with this problem too, because every teacher does. What did the rabbis do when a student would fall asleep or drift off? They would tell a story. They would tell a story to bring the attention of the students back. And we'll see an example of this later in the month. We also have tales of Elijah the prophet, and we'll return to him as well. Elijah the prophet, Eliyahu Hanavi, who according to the story in the Bible went up to heaven in a chariot of fire, still alive, and travels the world in disguise, appearing to Jews and others as a Jew, and often not as a Jew, appearing in the disguise of a non-Jew to bring help and succor when people are suffering or in trouble. And Elijah the prophet stories are their own category of story. And of course, Elijah also comes to every circumcision, every Brit Milah ceremony, and also appears every Saturday night to escort the Shabbat queen back into the week. And so there are certain moments associated with Elijah the prophet, and we'll see some of those stories later. So stories convey a lot of rich ideas, but one of the most important things I can share with you is that stories don't only convey ideas, stories themselves sometimes can constitute a moment of salvation. The great philosopher Martin Buber quoted a grandson of a student of the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov, of course, the founder of the Hasidic movement. He lived from around 1700 to 1760. We don't know exactly when he was born, but around 1700 to 1760. Traveled around Poland, the Carpathian Mountains, telling stories. We're going to see a lot of him together this month. And he had a student whose grandson said, my grandfather, the student of the Baal Shem Tov, was lame. Once they asked him to tell a story about his teacher, the Baal Shem Tov. And he began to tell a story of how the Baal Shem Tov, the Besht, would dance. And as he spoke, he stood and hopped and then started dancing. He forgot that he was lame. He forgot that he couldn't walk. And from that moment on, he was cured. Now that's the way to tell a story. The story itself can save. And it can save individuals and it can save communities. And I want to share with you a story called The Tale of the Teller, which is one of my favorite stories from the Baal Shem Tov or about the Baal Shem Tov. It's a Hasidic tale. And it's profound for a lot of reasons. Listen. When the Baal Shem Tov was on his deathbed, he knew that his time was drawing to an end. He called all of his students to him, and he gave each of them a special task that they should perform for the rest of their lives. From this one, this student, he told, should travel around teaching Torah. Another, he said, you should go around singing. Another, he said, you should travel and look for Jews who are oppressed, and you should raise money to support them. Each student had a different task. But one of the students, he said, your job will be to travel from town to town and from village to village telling stories about me. And then he said, you will know when your mission is accomplished. The Baal Shem Tov passed away, and for the next 10 years, this chassid, this follower of the Baal Shem Tov, carried out his mission. He traveled around from town to town and he told stories of his master, the Baal Shem Tov, things that he had seen himself or things that he had heard about. And one day someone told him that there was a very rich Jew in Vitebsk who paid money for stories. He paid 10 rubles for a story that he'd never heard before, and 5 rubles for a story that he had heard, plus traveling expenses. It was a long journey from where our storyteller was, but it was worth it. He knew it was worth it, and he was filled with stories. So he traveled, and he arrived at the rich man's home. He knocked on the door. He was greeted very warmly. It was a Thursday evening. And he was so tired from the journey that he went right to sleep. And he thought he'll tell a story tomorrow and make some money before Shabbat. But he woke up very late on Friday. And by the time he finished praying, it was already time to get ready for Shabbat. So he said, okay, I'll tell a story on Shabbat. At Shabbat dinner, he sat down with the rich man, and the rich man fed him very well. And then he said, okay, tell me a story. Our storyteller couldn't think of a single story. For the first time in the 10 years he's been telling stories, his mind is completely blank. He thought maybe he was going crazy. What's happening to me? He thought. He couldn't think of anything. So he said, okay, I'll try again tomorrow. He apologized to the rich man. He went to sleep. The next day at lunch, it was the same thing. He started to tell the story and his mind went blank. He couldn't do it. He couldn't think of anything. Then it was time for the third meal on Shabbat afternoon, which is a special time for storytelling and singing. And he tried again, and he couldn't think of a single story. He went to sleep that night feeling ashamed, embarrassed. And then he felt even worse when he woke up in the middle of the night because he heard his host in another room in the house weeping. The next morning, it was time for him to leave. The wealthy man was disappointed, but he was graceful about it and gracious, and he gave the storyteller a little bit of money for his expenses. And he accompanied him to the train station. He thought, who knows, maybe he'll have a story before he has to leave. And in the carriage ride, the storyteller was trying and trying to think of a story, but he couldn't. He apologized again, and he started walking toward his train, which would take him back to his hometown. And as he put his hand on the bar, on the rail, and put his foot on the first step of the train, a story suddenly popped into his head, and he called back to the rich man, a story, I have a story. And the rich man said, come back right away, come to my carriage, tell me, let's not waste any time, tell me the story. And the storyteller said, once the Baal Shem Tov took 10 of us, students, and told us to get into his carriage a little bit before Shabbat, Friday afternoon late. We got in the carriage because this happened often. And the Baal Shem Tov, as was his way, sat not facing the road where you would expect someone traveling on a carriage to sit, looking at the road and controlling the horses. The Baal Shem Tov sat facing us, facing backwards, and he let the horses go wherever they wanted to go. We felt air rushing past us very quickly as if we were flying through the air, and moments later, we landed somewhere. We arrived at a town, and this town seemed like a ghost town. It was a large town square. It was completely deserted. All the windows were boarded up, but on one side there was a stage, and there were some crosses and flaming torches. The Baal Shem Tov told us to follow him. He left the square, he walked into a narrow alley, he walked through some winding streets into what was obviously the Jewish ghetto, and he knocked on the door of one of the houses, and someone opened the door a crack, a Jew, and he said, are you crazy? What are you doing out there? You know this is the most dangerous time to be outdoors. Come in quickly. So they went inside. The man said, you can't be outside. This is the holiday where the Christians always attack the Jewish quarter, the Jewish ghetto. And there's a preacher who riles them up into an ecstasy of hatred, and it leads to a pogrom every year. This is the worst night of the year. The Bishop Thaddeus, he's the worst enemy of our people, and it's going to be violent and dangerous. The Baal Shem Tov turned to one of us students, and he said, I want you to go back to the square, and when the bishop begins to speak, you're going to pull on his robe and tell him the Baal Shem Tov wants to talk to him. The student gulped. The owner of the house was in shock, but the chassid, the student, being a good follower of the Baal Shem Tov, had faith in his master, faith in his Rebbe, his teacher, and he opened the door and he slipped outside. He went to the square. It was beginning to get dark. The square was crowded with people, and he saw the bishop stride up to the front of the stage and stand before the crowd in a crimson robe and a high-pointed hat. And the chassid made his way carefully through the crowd, whispering prayers under his breath. And he walked up to the front. He pulled on the robe of the bishop. And the bishop was about to start speaking. And he looked down. And he saw this Jew pulling on his robe. And he couldn't believe it. He was outraged. But the chassid said, "My master, the Baal Shem Tov, wants to see you. And he said you should come right away." The bishop turned pale. And he looked terrified. He said, "Not now, not now. Tell him I can't come now. I'm busy. Tell him I'll come later. Go away." The chassid made his way through the crowd again, miraculously unnoticed. He went back to the house. He told his master what had happened. The Baal Shem Tov said, "No, you go back and tell him if he doesn't come now, it's going to be too late." The chassid went back. He went back. He went to the stage. He pulled on the robe of the bishop. And the bishop looked stunned. He called out to the crowd, "I'm receiving a message from God. I need to be alone." And then he left the back of the stage, followed the chassid to the Baal Shem Tov. Minutes later, he was standing outside the house of the Jew in which the Baal Shem Tov was waiting. The Baal Shem Tov said, "Take off your cross and come inside." The bishop did. And the Baal Shem Tov looked at the bishop, and the bishop fell to the floor, weeping like a child. The Baal Shem Tov turned to the others who were present. He said, "This man was born a Jew. He even had a bar mitzvah. But he was lured to the church and eventually became an anti-Semite. And I saw in heaven that now there was an opening somehow that I could bring him back." The Baal Shem Tov went into a room with the former Bishop Thaddeus. They stayed together for an hour. And the bishop came out now dressed in different clothing, like a Jewish beggar. He left, and no one ever saw him again. This is the story our storyteller told the rich man. And he was surprised to see that the rich man was weeping, but he was weeping with joy. And he said, "This is the story I've been waiting for." He said, "I was the bishop. I was Bishop Thaddeus. And when the Baal Shem Tov took me into that room, he told me that I would live a life of repentance until someone came and told me my own story. And when someone came and told me my own story, then I would know that my repentance, my return, is accepted by God." There is telling a story, and there is retelling, listening, bearing witness to a story, and then there's telling someone their own story. And that's one of the most powerful things that can happen. And if you think about important points in life, you may have had that experience where someone told you your own story. Someone saw something about you clearly, more clearly than you could see it yourself. And this is the power of bearing witness to one another. This is the power of storytelling to one another. And I think that a society or a community is really a group of people who tell one another's stories. We tell stories about each other, who know each other well enough to tell those stories. And when we tell Jewish stories, we are living with Abraham and Sarah and Ruth and King David and Rabbi Akiva and Maimonides and the Baal Shem Tov. They follow us and accompany us in our lives, and we are never alone. So as we go into this month of storytelling, I want to ask you to think about stories that you love, stories that you maybe haven't told yet, stories that you maybe heard from parents or grandparents that are precious that you might want to pass on to others and share with others, because the world needs our stories and we need storytellers. And the art of storytelling is not a technical art. It's not learning when to pause in the story and when to raise your voice. It's a soul craft. It's learning how to open your heart to yourself, to your listeners, to the heart of the story. And I think there's nothing more important today than opening hearts. The great storyteller, Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, the Baal Shem Tov's great grandson, said, that when the Messiah comes, the Messiah will tell each of us our own story. That's what redemption looks like. We will be finally, ultimately seen and understood, and in hearing our own stories, we too will understand. So I'm going to stop here, although there's so much more to say. We'll have more time together over the coming weeks, but I want to open it up to your questions. Make sure we have a little bit of time for your questions, because those are very precious. So Ari, do you want to share any questions that you want to share from the chat?
Yeah, I'm just trying to figure out how I pin myself with you. So hold on for 1 second. Add to spot. Okay, here I am. Yes, well, I have a few questions few people have asked. So if anybody has other questions, I mean, you have a month to ask questions, so that's great. We're hopefully everything works out as planned. We'll have Ariel with us for the month, so you don't have to ask your question tonight. But here's the first question: what is really keeping people focused right now is all the charts behind you. I mean, obviously everything you've said, that's number one. But number two is people want to know, what is all the stuff on the wall behind you? What are you charting out back there?
Okay, so there's a big question on my mind. It's at the center of my work right now, which is how do we help and support people to change and become more compassionate and more courageous people? How do we educate for that? This is a question that I really was inspired to consider by Professor Elie Wiesel. We talked about this a lot. And my work right now is, as I already mentioned, creating the Witness Institute, which is a program to draw on Professor Wiesel's teachings to do just that, to train people and support people and nurture people to be compassionate, moral leaders. And what's on the wall is the beginning, and it extends all the way down. This is a long room. It extends down the wall and all the way around the other side of the room. I'm trying to really understand, well, what are the mechanics of moral transformation? How do we break down moral transformation? That's what's really on the wall behind me. And so there are some stories, there are references to teachings, there are references to books by Professor Wiesel, and there is also a calendar of how we're taking all of that material and mapping it out in a program of study that we intend to launch next month in February or very early March with a group of activist fellows from around the world. So that's what you see behind me. We haven't answered the question. I'm not sure it can be answered, but it can be responded to with a lot of action and a lot of learning.
And I think hopefully we'll meet some of the people you've been working with during this series that we have on Elie Wiesel starting this coming next Sunday.
Yeah.
Another question someone asked, you mentioned different types of stories, biblical stories, rabbinic stories, medieval to modern stories, but you didn't mention like Mizrahi or Sephardi stories. Are those going to come into play this month? Are those a separate type of story, or do they just fit in to what you've talked about so far?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm glad you mentioned it. I didn't mention Ashkenazi stories either, because medieval stories and modern stories are Ashkenazi, Sephardi, Mizrahi, Temani. We have many tribes, and in fact, we just finished reading about the original tribes, the 12 children, 12 sons of Jacob, and Dinah, the daughter of Jacob, and that teaches us something about how to relate to tribes. So it's really important to consider that. The Hasidic movement was predominantly Ashkenazi. One of the great encounters between Ashkenazi Eastern European Jewry and Sephardi Jewry, North African-based Jewry, almost happened between the Baal Shem Tov and Rabbi Chaim ibn Attar, the Or HaChaim, a great Sephardi commentator on the Bible and a great mystic. They tried very hard to meet one another, and they both said that if they had met, the Messiah would have come right then, because we need to bring back our people together. We need to create a reunion of the different tribes of our people. And it's true that very often, certainly in North American Jewish life, we forget about that diversity. So I appreciate the questioner for reminding us to talk about that. It's very important. And the stories that we're going to see are from different parts of the Jewish world. A lot of Hasidic stories, because that's the most central part of my own Jewish journey and identity. but also from other parts of the Jewish world. And remember that whether we're talking about Ashkenazi storytellers, sages, dreamers, travelers, or Sephardi or other sages, etc., they're all drawing on the rabbinic tradition. So the rabbis of the Talmud are the inspiration for the Jews everywhere around the world. And they have a common shared language in the Bible and in the Mishnah and Talmud, the early rabbinic literature, before we begin to separate and to travel. And we may even see a story about how that initial differentiation between Ashkenazi and Sephardi Jewry happened. There's one story, it's legendary, it's not historically accurate, but it's a story involving pirates about the origin of the split between Ashkenazi and Sephardi Jewry.
Do you know which series that will be in, so people who are signed up can be prepared?
No, because I think I will probably bring it in somewhat spontaneously.
Okay, good.
And if anyone is in any series and reminds me at the end of a session that you want to hear that story, I'm happy to tell it multiple times.
Of course, pirates, Jews, and Sephardi. Who wouldn't want to hear that story? So you are an artist. People have seen your art if they've looked at the information I've shared with them. Can you talk about art and stories and the connection between the two?
Yeah, I can actually show it too, quickly. So this is, I'll make it a little larger. This is a story about stories that some of you may know, that Professor Elie Wiesel told and also used as the opening in his book, The Gates of the Forest, and elsewhere. He loved this story. And the story goes like this, and these are my illustrations, so you can sort of notice the relationship between the text and the art as we go. When Rabbi Israel Baal Shem Tov, actually I'm going to make it larger, here. When Rabbi Israel Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidism, saw that the Jewish people were threatened by tragedy, he would go to a particular place in the forest where he lit a fire, recited a particular prayer, and asked for a miracle to save the Jews from the threat. Because of the holy fire and faithfulness of the prayer, the miracle was accomplished, averting the tragedy. Later, when the Baal Shem Tov's disciple, the Maggid of Mezerich, the great preacher of Mezerich, had to intervene with heaven for the same reason, he went to the same place in the forest, where he told the master of the universe that while he did not know how to light the fire, he could still recite the prayer. And again, the miracle was accomplished. Later still, Rabbi Moshe Leib of Sassov, in turn a disciple of the Maggid of Mezerich, went into the forest to save his people. I do not know how to light the fire, he pleaded with God, and I do not know the prayer, but I can find the place, and this must be sufficient. Once again, the miracle was accomplished. When it was the turn of Rabbi Israel of Rizhin, the great-grandson of the Maggid of Mezerich, who was named after the Baal Shem Tov, Israel, to avert the threat, he sat in his armchair holding his head in his hands and said to God, I'm unable to light the fire. I don't know the prayer. I cannot even find the place in the forest. All I can do is tell the story. That must be enough. And it was enough. If we want to save our world, we must tell stories. That's my gloss on the story. So the relationship for me between art and story is very deep, and it's different depending on the moment that you catch me in and the project I'm working on. But in this case, I was really interested in the limiting of the color palette as we go. A lot of colors, fewer colors, only 2 colors, and then all the colors come back. And it's a way of playing out and sort of commenting on the feeling of what happens when you lose the depth and the thickness and diversity of Jewish culture, or Jewish technology, spiritual technology. And it gets flatter and thinner and less colorful, or to use a different metaphor, fewer notes in the scale, and we're losing the possibility of ecstatic music because we only have a couple of notes to work with. What happens to us, and how do we get it back? So for me, art and music both are ways of engaging with some of those questions. And hopefully over time, we'll have a chance to talk about this more, because I'll be bringing in other pieces of artwork as we go, and there's a lot to say about this.
Thank you. Can you talk about who are your favorite contemporary storytellers in the Jewish world?
There are several. I like Edgar Keret. I like Bram Presser, if you haven't read his books, especially the Book of Dirt. I like Dara Horn. I like people who are in dialogue with the past, but in very creative ways. Rachel Kaddish or Kaddish. But I also look for inspiration beyond the Jewish world, and I think there are non-Jewish authors who capture something of the elements that I've been exploring with you tonight. And I'll just name one of my favorite authors, who's no longer with us, but Ursula Le Guin, who's a very ethical, compassionate author of literature, and who always was annoyed when people described her work as science fiction, but a lot of people describe it as science fiction. And it's worth exploring her work because she's drawing on very old spiritual traditions and questions, and trying to understand what does it take to become a mature, ethical, compassionate human being. And that's one of the questions that I think about a lot.
Can you spell her name? People are asking.
Sure. Ursula, Ursula, Le Guin, capital L-E, and I think it's, I can't remember now if it's two words or one word, but capital G-U-I-N. And I'll just add that if you look in the back of Witness, of my book Witness, Lessons from Elie Wiesel's Classroom, there's a reading list of a bunch of other books that I love, and also that Professor Wiesel taught over and over again in his 40-year career as a teacher at Boston University.
And I want to impress. I mean, I haven't read as much as I would like to in the last year or two. It's hard with the little kids running around, but I have read Ariel's book, and I couldn't put it down. So if you haven't read it and you're a CSP patron or a legacy member, just email me. I'll make sure you get it within the next 4 or 5 days to read, okay? If not, just purchase it and read it. It will, I don't know if it'll change your life. It could change your life. It's that kind of book. It's very well written. It's very thoughtful, and it's very rich. Can you talk about yourself in stories, your earliest memories, and why you are so, it's a little bit autobiography about you to share with the group, your earliest love with stories, what you can remember, what you want to share?
Yeah, it's a good question. So there's a lot to say here also. We have another 4 hours, right? Okay. You're all, most of you are on the West Coast, so it's early. So first of all, I grew up with an awareness of my family history. My father, who's here, told me and my sister stories about his grandmother that really are still very much with me. The earliest family image that I recall on that side of the family, and Abba, if you want to jump in on the chat, you can add to this if you'd like, is an image of feathers flying through the air during the Kishinev pogrom, when my great-grandmother was, I think, 12 or 13 years old. And the Cossacks who were perpetrating this pogrom on the Jewish community were cutting open pillows to look for jewelry that they thought the Jews had hidden in the pillows. And soon after, her parents sent her with her little sister to the United States with, I think, $20 in her pocket. And so I was aware of these kinds of images from my own family history. And these things are important to know and to think about and to transmit and to feel in touch with, because these stories really shaped us. I wouldn't exist if not for that moment, right? I wouldn't be here. I certainly wouldn't be who I am. And I think that's true for all of us. So I had an awareness of ancestry and family history and family stories. I also went to yeshiva, where we were deeply immersed in the stories of first of the the biblical characters of our ancestors in that sense. And I remember the first time I saw a verse from the Torah. We started with, as one custom is to start here, we started with the story of Abraham and Lech Lecha, when God says to Abraham, go forth, or as I learned later, it can also be translated as go to yourself. Lech Lecha, go to you, go forth to a land that I will show you. And I remember, and this relates to the art as well, I remember the first letter of that verse. It's a letter Vav, Vayomer. Vav is the sixth letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and it's a letter that represents connection because it means and. Vav HaChibur, for those who are into Hebrew grammar and biblical grammar. And I somehow remember it's almost like that Vav was seared onto my consciousness in a way that's difficult to describe or explain, but there was a sense of real intimacy with Avraham and Sarah and so on. And so, there's a way to teach Bible or any story at a remove with a sense of formality. But I think the lucky ones among us are those who are introduced to these characters, these people, these giant, mysterious personalities with a real sense of intimacy. And that, I think, has shaped me a lot, that sense of intimacy, because that's what I look for in a story. I look for that warmth, and I look for the sense of closeness, and at the same time, the sense of mystery. In other words, I feel like I'm being introduced to someone who's greeting me very warmly, but I see in their eyes that there's a lot more to learn about them. That's how I feel when I encounter the Baal Shem Tov stories that we were talking about, or many of the stories that we're going to learn together. There's a warmth and a familiarity, but there's a real sense of mystery, and those two things together make for a very powerful combination, a kind of entrancing combination. And that was my early experience with Jewish stories.
Thank you. So before we end, three quick things. Number one, I said this to you last week when we were talking, but just in case people haven't noticed, the uncanny resemblance of Ariel to a very famous director that my kids love, George Lucas. So,
that's another major influence in my life that we didn't talk about.
Star Wars.
Yeah, we'll add a course on Star Wars. And
well, you should know that my 2-year-old and 4-year-old, they love Star Wars. I mentioned it just to give them something interesting to think about for the beginning of the they were in lockdown at home. They had never seen it, of course. We would not allow them to watch Star Wars, but we have the golden books, which give you the Star Wars stories. And we have like 20 golden books. I've read them all. And they know every character of Star Wars. They know their names. They know like the main characters, the ancillary characters, the story. So Star Wars is incredibly powerful. I was thinking we should take our stories, our patriarchs and matriarchs, and put them in space and resell them to the younger generation, because they'll definitely read it.
So I wanted to say I've played with that idea, strangely. and also just came across a young adult novelist whose name is escaping me, but he wrote a book called The Way Back that I encourage. It's for older kids, not for kids your age, but for older kids. It's a beautiful young adult kind of fantasy journey novel for middle schoolers, I think, and up. And it's based on Jewish legend and Hasidic legend and Jewish mysticism. It's very well done.
And of course, whenever I bring up Star Wars, we also get the Star Trek people, and I'm both, you should know. So I love Star Wars and Star Trek. Star Trek is a little more complicated to do with a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old, although I try to introduce the characters to them. Star Wars is more of this epic saga, and Star Trek is incredible, individual presentations about Cold War, American history, and complicated moral and ethical issues. But yeah, those two are great models for trying to teach contemporary students. In fact, those stories are, if they don't watch it, they read it. It's less violent than trying to read the biblical stories. So
very much so. And on that point, we're going to, in the course on Tales of Conflict, we're going to spend some time looking at wrestling with difficult texts, because you're absolutely right. The biblical texts I
can't read them to the kids.
Right. And so like there's a lot of questions there about how do we deal with things in our sacred texts that seem to be unethical or violent, right? There's a whole conversation there that we're going to get into a little bit. Ari, can I just jump in with two more things quickly before I forget?
Sure.
I just noticed that we're joined also by another very special person tonight, Martha Houtman, who was Professor Elie Wiesel's, I don't even know how to say it, assistant, but more than that, a sort of operations manager, MC, curator of the classroom for many, many years, 30 plus, 35 years. And Martha's the person who allowed me into Professor Wiesel's classroom. So I owe her a lifelong debt of gratitude. And Martha, it's great to see you. And I also just wanted to say, for those of you who had a question that we didn't get to, we'll be in touch all month, but you can email me even after this session with a question if you'd like. And if you go to my website, you'll see there's a contact tab that you can press on, and it'll go to my personal email, and I will respond to you. It's arielburger.com.
I'm going to chat the email right now. What email should they use?
The email is, I should know this, but I think it's info@arielburger.com, but just in case, the better way is to go to www.arielburger.com and then hit the contact button. It's ARIELBURGER. And you'll see contact, and that'll go to my email. That's it, Ari.
So, I mean, before we end, I wanted to say, how perfect is it to honor Martin and Tamar Brower? I'm going to mute you for 1 second because I'm getting feedback through there. Because Martin is a storyteller. He's written 3 books, the stories. Even he doesn't make up stories about dragons in Orange County. I'm sure they were here before he was here. But he tells stories, and his stories are great. And they're stories about his life. And even though it's not my personal history, it touches on my personal history because I moved here and I've made my life here. And Martin moved here with Tamar, and they made their lives here. So I urge you all to look at those stories. And again, bringing it back to Martin and Tamar, great people to honor this month, but read their stories. They're great stories. I wanted to ask just, we have coming up on Tuesday, it's our first series, and it's called The Greatest Jewish Tales. That's your personal, it's subjective, right? And I don't know if you know what you're going to actually teach us yet as The Greatest Jewish Tales, but that's on Tuesday. And then Wednesday, we have stories by and about Hasidic masters. And then on Thursday, Tales of Conflict and Wrestling with Sacred Texts. And then on Sunday, Life and Legacy of Elie Wiesel. People have asked, how do we sign up for this? If they don't know, just go to www.occsp.net. A lot of stuff is up there. You can email me as well. I'll put the chat in again. Can you tell us, what's the question I would ask? I guess just give us a promo as to what's coming up this week.
Okay, so we've got a lot going on this week. And I've been spending a lot of time, especially for The Greatest Jewish Tales, narrowing it down because, of course, it's such a difficult thing to choose. So I'm not going to give away too much, but we're beginning, as you said, with Greatest Jewish Tales. We've got 4 sessions, and I'm looking for the criteria. We're going to talk in the first session about what are the criteria by which I chose the greatest Jewish tales of all time, which is a very difficult thing to do. And I will share some of those criteria, and then we'll look at one story. We're going to see a short video of Professor Wiesel talking about this story. It's a story you know, but it's a take on the story that you probably never heard before. That has a lot of implications for how to be a person, how to be a human being, how to deal with loss and longing. So that's number 1. Then we're going to talk about the Hasidic masters. We're going to begin with the Baal Shem Tov, who we've spent time with tonight, but we're going to go much deeper into his life and the background against which we have to understand him, the situation of the Jews of Eastern Europe at that time and place, and his core messages and legacies and stories. And the story, we saw one story tonight, but there are many other stories about him and the way he transformed people's lives. So that'll be the first session in the Hasidic Masters series. And if you're interested in doing some pre-reading for that, we're not going to necessarily read this together, but if you really want to read something amazing, the best introduction to the Hasidic Masters is the book Souls on Fire by Professor Elie Wiesel, of blessed memory. It's the book that really got me into the Hasidic Masters in the first place when I was 17 or 18 years old. It was a life-changing experience and still is for me. So I encourage you to read that if you're looking for something more in advance. And then we're going to talk about tales of conflict. So there's a lot of conflict and controversy throughout Jewish history. It's built into our to our DNA, our ways of thinking, because we're always searching for truth. And we know that there are multiple ways of looking at things. And so whenever we're discussing a point of law or a question of how to build community or make communal decisions, we're going to bump into conflict. We're going to see over the course of that series 4 essential moments of conflict between 2 opposed positions and ideologies that had massive implications for Jewish history. But in this first session, we're going to begin with a little bit of discussion of the positive role of conflict and controversy and the way that it can be really generative and has been throughout Jewish history. Then we'll go into where things went off the rails sometimes. And finally, the life and legacy of Elie Wiesel. So much to say about this. We're going to begin with the background and context for his life, where he came from, what were his influences, who were his influences, what were his early experiences that shaped him as a person before the Holocaust and during and immediately after the Holocaust. And then we'll proceed the following week to talk about his core themes and motifs and preoccupations, the things that he really spent his life exploring and wrestling with. And finally, we'll talk about his legacy and message for today.
Terrific. Well, I wanted to thank everybody for being with us, and thank Ariel for being with us from Sharon, Massachusetts. Thank you all. Many of you, many of you are from California, but there's a lot of people from around the country and the East Coast. So thank you for joining us. If you're new to CSP, welcome. Go to occsp.net. People keep asking, how do we sign up for the classes? They're all on the website. You can email me. Hopefully you got the MailChimp invitation to all the programs. You have to sign up, as I mentioned, for each of the class series separately, and there's some programs you sign up for separately. That way we can keep things organized as best we can. Remember, we're keeping track. Those of you who attend all 20 programs will be getting a special gift from CSP. And what a terrific way to kick off, Ariel. You did exactly what I wanted. You gave us meat, and you also gave us a good advertisement for the rest of the month, substance and something to look forward to. I hope to see you all over the coming months. I see we have Ada Class-Gilbert, who we honored a few years ago. We've got the Vogelfangers, who we've honored. Boy, we get to honor great people at CSP. So thank you, everybody. Have a great evening for everybody. It's 5:30 out here. It's 8:30 in Boston. Peter Mesnick and Linda Mesnick from your synagogue, Temple Beth Shalom. I wanted to thank you for supporting CSP, and looking forward to seeing you guys. Any closing thoughts, Ariel?
Yeah, Ari, just want to thank you for organizing this. And I am blown away by CSP and have been since I first heard about it a year and a half ago and got to visit in person. And I hope to visit you all again in person. But in the meantime, I'm very happy to be with you in this format, because we really can connect over Zoom. I've learned over the last months, it's possible to really make deep connections and learn a lot together. And so I'm excited for this month, and I'm grateful to be with you all. Ari, you're muted.
Thank you, everybody. Go home and have dinner if you haven't eaten on the West Coast. If you haven't eaten on the East Coast, you're starving. Eat something and go to bed or do something productive. Watch a good show. Watch Star Wars, Star Trek, read the Bible, read a story. Someone sent me the Arthur Green book. Did you send me the Arthur Green book? Because out of the blue, the book you just mentioned showed up on my doorstep a few days ago, the Souls on Fire. So no name.
The book by Elie Wiesel. I didn't send it to you.
No, not the Elie Wiesel book. I think it's the Arthur Green book. Which is the one?
Souls on Fire is Professor Wiesel.
Okay,
Art
no,
Green.
someone sent me the Art Green book, which was similar titled, I think.
Interesting.
Don't know
Wasn't
where
me.
it came from. Okay, well, I have a lot to read, I guess, the next few days. But we will share follow-up material from this program. I'll work with Ariel on some of the books that he mentioned, so you guys can look at them at your leisure and read them and enjoy them. So with that, I'm going to go home and have dinner with my little guys, and looking forward to seeing you a lot. We got 19 programs, 19, all different. So take care. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Ariel. Thank you, Browers, for being great people. We love you. Bye, guys. Bye, Ariel. I can try unmute. I'll unspotlight you so you can see who's here. Let's see. I have to unspotlight you. That's what I'm trying to figure out what to do, because I can't see the. Can you unspotlight yourself? I'll do it. I can figure it this way. go.
I can hide my self view, which is a very deep thing.
Remove spotlight. So if I remove spotlight and then I do view.
We're good. I can see
Okay.
everyone, I think.
Okay, now you can see people.
Yeah.
You can see the Vogel
Hi, everyone.
fingers. You can see the Browers and Sheldon.
Yeah.
You can see Howard Turgutsky, Kathy Kobayashi, welcome. Chris Texier is there. Debbie Meline, I think a big fan because Debbie came to your program and then brought you back to the JCC in Irvine. This is bonus time, people. This is bonus time. If you're here, you can hang out for a few minutes. Mike Rubin. See, I'm missing Mike. Mike and Alita, you know, they would be there. They would ask questions. And now they're like, you know, I just see him online. I see Faith Hirschler. I see Francine Sokol. Welcome.
Hi, Francine.
Jeff Kaufman and Mary Kraft. Batya Swed, Sheila Silver. I see Peter Mesnick, and is it with his new cat? Peter, is that your cat? That's Peter's newest member of the family. That's his name is Shmuel. What? No, I'm kidding. I think it's like Ali Jimbo. So in case that may be a question. So if we have too many people who have gone to any lectures, you're gonna have to know what's the name of Peter Mesnick's new cat. The answer is Ali Jimbo Mesnick. I suggested he name it Ari. It'd be Ari Cat, but he didn't go with that. So I would have been, you know, been very nice. And we've got Toby Balma with us. So people are still hanging out. Go do something, people. Go eat. Go somewhere. You know, Ariel will not leave till you're gone. I'm just telling you. He'll just sit there, Vivian, and he will not. My Aunt Adrian is here from Boston. See the Malmans. My Uncle Trevor Katz. I think my parents, you know, we've had a lot of like parents of our speakers join, which is very nice lately. We've had, and they actually participated in programs. Marilyn Hassett, so she's iconic. Marilyn, we got to see you. Do you want to come on video there? I think Marilyn has retired from the JCC though. I don't know if that's true, but never retired from Jewish education is my guess. But I remember working with her 20 years. There's Adrian. There's my Aunt Adrian. She lives in Boston. She goes to Sharon for the high holidays to see my brother David and my sister-in-law Sherry, and maybe when she just wants to go travel there. I don't know.
And this is the Ruch side of the family that traveled to Lithuania.
Adrian was married to my uncle Stanley Ruch, and Stanley really collected a lot of information about our family, Ruch family, and we're going to have. So Adrian will be on this. Adrian, we have 30 family members so far signed up for our Ruch family adventure, which I don't know 25 of them.
Pretty awesome.
The Reuven Ruch is going to be with us from Australia, so he'll be interesting. That's just inside discussion. It's called Inside Baseball. If you're still here, I'm doing a virtual walking tour of my shtetl in February. You'll all be hearing about it because we may be rolling it out as a concept either through CSP or another way where you can take your family with you to go back to your family towns.
All right, is there a video of the trip?
Is there a video of my personal trip or the one?
Yeah. Did you take a video of the trip that you already did? No,
I have like tons of pictures from my trip.
Okay.
It was amazing. Lithuania is definitely worth going to. It's very interesting to reconnect and see. When you see the place where your family grew up, you understand some of the imagery in their writing or their art. So if you go to Poland or Lithuania and you go to the forests, you go to you see the cities. It's you know, it's very challenging, but very much worth it. And so when I announced that the Ruch family was going to Rakashek, all of a sudden these people I started signing up from, as I mentioned, Israel, Canada, South Africa, Australia, the United States, all over the United States. And so I thought, oh, maybe we have something. So I'm actually going to do one to Puckroy hopefully in April with the other side of the family. So we can do the cat side, the Ruch side. If you are interested in this type of adventure, you can email me, but you'll be hearing more about it. Okay, everybody, I'm really going to go. Thanks.
Bye,
nice
everyone.
seeing you all. Take care. Bye,
Bye-bye.
Eddie. Have a good one.